I did not drop the wrench. I heard my daughter say, loud enough to carry through the screen door, that the sooner I was gone, the sooner the house stopped being a museum for a dead man's leftovers. I stood there in the flower bed, knees deep in her prize-winning peonies, and I did not gasp. I did not call out. I just listened to my only daughter tell her husband that keeping me alive past my usefulness was, in her exact words, bad financial planning. Let me back up. I wasn't supposed to be near that window at all. I was supposed to be around the side of the house, invisible, fixing the sprinkler line that had been flooding the garden bed for a week. A job Claire had called me about that morning, with the same tone she'd used to order a plumber off an app. I hadn't planned on hearing anything, but the leak traced itself right under the kitchen window, and the window was open, and Claire's voice has never once in her life known how to stay quiet. He's 71, Marcus. He's not going to last forever, but he's also not going to just conveniently die on a schedule that works for us. We need him declared unfit before the Merivale deal closes, or the trust doesn't release, and we lose the house to the bank in April. I stayed frozen with my hand still wrapped around the shutoff valve. The water had stopped running through the pipe, but something else had started running cold through me, a full, total rewiring of everything I understood about my own daughter. I had raised Claire alone after her mother died, worked 22 years at the freight yard so she could go to the college I never got to see the inside of, sat in the bleachers at every softball game in a lawn chair I'd bought secondhand because new ones cost too much. And there she was, on the other side of a thin pane of glass, talking about me like I was a line item that had overstayed its usefulness. I didn't storm the back door. I didn't bang on the window and demand an explanation. 31 years running a regional trucking operation teaches you one thing above all else. The man who reacts first is always the man who loses the negotiation. I wiped the mud off my boots on the grass, walked around to the side gate the way I'd come in, and let myself back out onto the street like nothing at all had happened. The adjustment, that's the only word I have for what began in me right then, had already started. To understand how I ended up crouched in my own daughter's flower bed, listening to her plan my legal erasure, you have to go back to the phone call 3 hours earlier. I was in my recliner in the small rental house I've lived in since Diane passed, halfway through a crossword, when Claire called. She didn't ask how I was doing. She never does anymore. She told me the sprinkler line had burst and was flooding the yard right before her and Marcus hosted their neighborhood association mixer, and could I please come fix it before people started arriving? And could I please park down the block instead of in the driveway? Because, and I remember this word for word, the Hendersons are coming, Dad, and I don't need them seeing your truck parked out front like we run a repair shop. I didn't argue. I've stopped arguing with Claire a long time ago. I grabbed my toolbox and drove the 40 minutes out to the house in Brookhaven Estates. The house, I should mention, that I bought outright, in cash, 4 years ago as a wedding gift. The same year I quietly sold off the last of my ownership stake in the freight company for just north of $9 million. Claire doesn't know that number. Nobody outside my lawyer and my accountant knows that number. After Diane died, I made a decision I would live simply, keep my head down, let Claire build her own life without a father hovering over her like a walking inheritance. Diane and I used to say that money handed too early rots a person from the inside. I believed that. I still believe it. I just never imagined it would be used as evidence against me instead. I parked down the block like I was told. I walked the sprinkler line, found the crack, fixed it in under 20 minutes, and it was on my way back to the gate, wiping my hands on my jeans, that I heard Claire's voice come sailing out that open kitchen window, clear as a church bell, discussing the exact date by which I needed to be legally incompetent. I didn't go back to my truck right away. Instead, once the yard had gone quiet and I heard Claire and Marcus move off toward the front of the house to greet their guests, I let myself in through the side door that leads to what used to be Marcus's home office, a room Claire had shown me proudly on my first visit, all dark wood and recessed lighting, like a movie set for a man playing at being important. His laptop sat open on the desk, screen glowing, unlocked. Men who think they can't be touched never bother locking anything in their own house. I sat down in his leather chair. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. I only knew that a woman doesn't say the words before the Merivale deal closes, unless there is a Merivale deal and a paper trail, and I intended to find both. It took me 4 minutes of scrolling through his files to understand that Marcus and Claire were not simply impatient, they were drowning. Marcus ran what he called a boutique real estate investment firm, though the folder labeled Merivale Holdings Confidential told a different story. They had leveraged 3 properties against a construction loan that had ballooned past what the underlying land was worth, and the only thing standing between them and total collapse was a balloon payment due in 11 weeks, a payment they had no way of making unless a family liquidity event came through first. I kept reading. Buried 3 folders deep, labeled with a file name that made my stomach drop, was a document titled simply DAD POA Draft. It was a durable power of attorney, my name typed across the top, already formatted, already witnessed by a notary I had never met, waiting only on a doctor's letter confirming diminished capacity to become active. Attached beneath it was an email thread with a man named Dr. Silas Renfro, a psychiatrist whose signature, according to the thread, could be purchased for the right price and the right story. Claire had written to him 3 days earlier. Her exact words, "He's sharp when you meet him, but we can work with that. We just need the letter." I sat very still in that leather chair for a long moment. I thought about the year Claire had walked across a stage in a cap and gown I'd paid for in cash, working overtime shifts nobody else wanted so there'd be no loans to pay off. I thought about Diane and what she would have said if she'd lived to see her daughter type the sentence, "We just need the letter," about her own father's mind. I forwarded everything, the POA draft, the email thread, 3 years of bank statements showing where startup consulting fees I'd been quietly wiring. Marcus had actually gone to an email account of my own that neither of them knew existed. I cleared the sent folder. I stood up, straightened the chair exactly the way I'd found it, and walked out through the office door into the hallway, where I nearly collided with Claire carrying a tray of deviled eggs toward the patio. "What are you doing in here?" she snapped, her eyes dropping to my boots on her hardwood. "Dad, I told you. The guests are God. Just, the bathroom's down the other hall. Why would you even—" "Sorry, sweetheart," I said, and let my shoulders round forward the way they've started to on their own these past few years, though this time I let them round a little further than they needed to. "Wrong door." Old man's memory. Something flickered across her face when I said memory, a kind of interest she didn't bother to hide fast enough. I filed that away too. I muttered another apology, told her the sprinkler was fixed, and shuffled out the front door past a cluster of guests in blazers who looked straight through me like I was the hired help. I got in my truck. Before I even turned the key, my phone buzzed with a text from my health insurance carrier. "Your recent premium payment could not be processed. Please update billing information to avoid lapse in coverage." I hadn't missed a payment in 19 years of retirement. I stared at that message a long time. They weren't just planning to have me declared unfit on paper. They were quietly making sure that if my heart, which had already given me one scare 2 winters back, decided to act up in the meantime, there'd be nothing to cover the hospital bill and nothing to complicate the timeline. I put the truck in drive and pulled away from Brookhaven Estates without looking back at the house I'd paid for with my own 2 hands. I drove straight to a diner off Route 9, the kind of place with a cracked vinyl booth held together by duct tape and coffee that tastes like it's been sitting since the Reagan administration. It's exactly the kind of place Claire wouldn't be caught inside of, which made it the only place I trusted to think clearly. I called Walter. Walter Higgins had been my attorney for 26 years, ever since the freight company was just 4 trucks and a dream I couldn't afford. He was the only living person who knew the real size of the trust I'd been sitting on since the sale, and the only one I'd trust with what I'd just found. He slid into the booth across from me 40 minutes later, took one look at my face, and didn't bother with hello. I told him everything, in the same flat, controlled voice I used to use, closing multi-million-dollar freight contracts. The overheard conversation. The POA draft with my name on it. The corrupt psychiatrist. The insurance lapse that wasn't an accident. Walter has represented some hard men in his career. Corporate sharks who'd cut their own mothers out of a deal for 2 extra points of margin, and even he went pale by the time I finished. "Marcus, this isn't financial trouble anymore," he said quietly. "This is a plan to have you declared incompetent so they can access the trust, and it sounds like they're not being careful about whether you're alive to see it happen or not." I told him I wanted the power of attorney nullified immediately, wanted my name scrubbed from anything with Marcus's signature on it before the day was over. Walter shook his head slowly. "Filing anything now," he explained, "would trigger an automatic notice Marcus would know within the hour that I was onto them. And a cornered man who's already contemplating fraud doesn't calm down when he's caught. He accelerates. He destroys evidence." He panics in ways that get dangerous for the person he's already decided is disposable. Give me 48 hours, Walter said. Let them think they're still winning. We use that time to make sure that when this comes down, it comes down completely, and there's no wiggle room left for either of them. I agreed. But I wasn't going to spend those 48 hours sitting in my recliner waiting. I told Walter about Marcus's balloon payment, about Merivale Holdings hanging by a thread 11 weeks from collapse. I told him I wanted to use the trust quietly, through a shell entity, no names attached, to buy up Marcus's outstanding debt from whatever private lender was holding it. I wanted to own the paper on my own son-in-law's failing empire before he ever knew I'd found out what he was building behind my back. Walter's eyes sharpened the way they used to before a big trial. He said he could have it done within 36 hours. Lenders holding distressed debt jump at a clean cash buyout, no questions asked. Marcus would get a form letter saying his loan had been sold to a new holding company. He'd have no earthly idea the buyer was the same man he was trying to have committed. Then Walter's face changed. He reached into his briefcase and slid a single folder across the table, a background check I'd asked him to run the day before, on instinct alone. He tapped a line item on a printed bank statement, a $5,000 retainer paid 2 days earlier to a Dr. Silas Renfro. I already know who that is, I said. I found the emails. Then you know what he does? Walter said. For the right fee, he doesn't evaluate patients. He writes verdicts. He'll walk into your house, ask you 3 questions designed to trip you up, and sign whatever letter Claire and Marcus need to have you declared incapacitated. And once that letter's filed, it doesn't matter how sharp you are in this booth right now. On paper, you'll be gone. I felt something in my chest go from hot to ice cold, all in the space of a breath. I thought about the summer I taught Claire to drive in an empty church parking lot, my hand hovering over the wheel, never once grabbing it, letting her make her own mistakes because that's what you do for someone you love. I thought about her voice through that kitchen window, calm as a weather report, discussing the timeline of my own erasure. The grief that had been sitting on my chest since that window lifted all at once, and what replaced it was something harder. I told Walter we weren't going to run from this. We were going to let them bring their bought doctor right to my front door. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my dark living room and watched the moon fade into gray morning, running the numbers in my head the way I used to before a hostile buyout. At 9 sharp the next morning, there was a knock at my door, sharp, cheerful, entirely too eager. It was Claire and Marcus, holding a basket of muffins like a couple auditioning for a role in their own alibi. We wanted to check on you, Dad, Claire said, stepping past me into the house before I'd fully opened the door. You scared us yesterday. You seemed so foggy. I let my shoulders sag. I let my hand tremble, just slightly against the doorframe. Foggy how? I asked, keeping my voice thin. Marcus took the lead this time, his face arranged into a mask of gentle concern. I recognized instantly from 100 boardroom performances I'd sat through in my old life. You don't remember, do you? He said. Not a question. You were standing in the driveway for almost 20 minutes yesterday afternoon, just staring at nothing. Claire knocked on the truck window and you didn't even recognize her at first. It was a complete fabrication. I had left directly for the diner, but I widened my eyes the way a frightened old man might and murmured something about being tired lately, about the days blurring together more than they used to. I watched relief wash over both of them like sunlight. They believed they had me exactly where they wanted me. That's actually why we're here, Marcus said, pulling a small amber bottle from his jacket pocket. No label, no pharmacist markings, just a plain white sticker reading Daily Supplement in block letters. We talked to a specialist. This is supposed to help with circulation, memory, that kind of thing. We want to see you take the first one, just so we know it's working. I looked at that pill sitting in Claire's open palm and understood exactly what it was for. Not memory, not circulation. Something to make me slow, foggy, agreeable, something to help along the narrative they'd need Dr. Renfro to sign off on. I took the pill from her hand with a trembling grip, thanked them both with tears. I let rise real and hot in my eyes and shuffled toward the kitchen sink for a glass of water. I ran the tap loud. I coughed hard enough to cover the motion, slid the pill down into my shirt pocket between 2 fingers, and threw my head back to swallow water alone. When I turned around, empty-handed and glassy-eyed, Marcus and Claire exchanged a look I wasn't meant to see, a small, satisfied nod between conspirators. They told me to rest, to stay off the phone, that they'd check on me later. Marcus told me, on his way out my own front door, that he loved me. I have never heard 4 words land so hollow in my life. The moment their car pulled out of my driveway, I straightened up, walked to my kitchen counter, and sealed that pill inside a sandwich bag. I drove it directly to a private lab. A colleague from my freight days had recommended years ago for cargo testing disputes, the kind of place that doesn't ask questions and doesn't talk to anyone but the person who paid for the test. 3 days later, the results came back. The pill was a mild sedative, off-label, the kind that would leave a healthy man groggy, confused, and slow to answer basic questions. Exactly the state you'd want your subject in if a bought doctor was coming by to ask him what year it is and who's currently president. I called Walter. The debt purchase had gone through clean a shell company called Ridgeline Capital, now quietly owned every dollar Marcus owed on the collapsing Maryvale project, though he had no idea his own father-in-law sat behind that name. I told Walter it was time. We set the date. I would let Claire and Marcus schedule their wellness visit with Dr. Renfro. Let them walk through my front door thinking the trap was theirs, and let it close around them instead. The morning it happened, I sat in my recliner in a cardigan. Diane had knitted me years ago, playing every bit the fragile old man they'd built their whole plan around. Dr. Renfro arrived at 11, a soft-spoken man in an expensive coat who asked me exactly the kind of leading questions Walter had warned me about. What day is it? Who's the president? Can you tell me your daughter's name? Questions designed less to diagnose than to manufacture confusion on the record. I answered everyone wrong, deliberately. I watched him nod along, satisfied, scribbling notes, while Claire hovered by the doorway with an expression I could only describe as relief dressed up as concern. And then Walter walked through my front door, 2 police detectives behind him, and the room went very still. Walter laid it all out calmly, the way he'd laid out 100 closing arguments before he retired from trial work, the emails between Claire and Dr. Renfro discussing the fee for a fraudulent evaluation, the forged power of attorney document with my name typed in before any doctor had ever examined me, the sedative pulled from the lab and matched against Marcus's prescription history. And finally, almost as an afterthought, the fact that Ridgeline Capital, the entity now holding every dollar of Marcus's collapsing real estate debt, was a holding company I personally controlled. I watched the color drain out of both their faces in real time. Dr. Renfro tried to explain himself to the detectives and only managed to dig himself in deeper. Claire turned to me, her voice cracking for what might have been the first time in years, and asked how I could do this to my own daughter. I stood up from my recliner, no trembling hand, no rounded shoulders, just a man standing at his full height for the first time in front of her in a long while, and I told her I had learned the words from her. I repeated back to her, slow and even, the exact sentence I'd heard through that kitchen window. Bad financial planning. She flinched like I'd struck her. The detectives took Dr. Renfro into custody that same afternoon on fraud charges that would eventually cost him his license and land him in front of a federal judge. Marcus was indicted 3 months later on charges of financial elder abuse and fraud, the paper trail from his own laptop doing most of the work for the prosecution. He is currently serving a 4-year sentence and has plenty of quiet hours to think about the balloon payment he never had to worry about, because his own father-in-law owned the debt the whole time. Claire was not charged criminally. Walter made sure of that out of whatever love I still had left for her. But the civil judgment stripped her of any claim to my trust, present or future, and she and Marcus divorced within the year. The Brookhaven house sold at auction to cover what remained of their debts. 6 months have passed since the morning Walter walked through my door with 2 detectives behind him. I don't think about that kitchen window as often as I thought I would. Some mornings I still do. I kept the house in Brookhaven Estates. I didn't sell it, though the bank practically begged me to take the highest bid at auction and walk away with the cash. I'd had enough of cash sitting quiet in a trust doing nothing but attracting people who wanted a piece of it. I wanted the house to mean something different than it had meant for the 4 years Claire and Marcus lived in it, so I turned it into something else. With Walter's help, I converted the property into a transitional home for young men and women aging out of the foster system with nowhere left to go. Kids who've spent their whole lives being told they're a burden, the same word Claire once used about me through an open window. We cover rent while they finish trade school or community college. We teach them how to balance a checkbook, how to fix a leaking pipe, how to hold their heads up in a room full of people who assume the worst about them just from a glance. There are no networking mixers on that lawn anymore. No Blazers, no Hendersons peering down their noses at a work truck parked at the curb. Just 6 kids this spring, soon to be 8, learning that a house can be a foundation instead of a trophy. I still drive out most Saturdays to check the sprinkler line myself. The same line I was fixing the day my whole understanding of my daughter came apart in a flower bed. I could pay someone else to do it. I choose not to. There's a particular kind of peace in kneeling in that same dirt, wrench in hand, knowing that this time, nobody on the other side of that window is waiting for me to disappear. A young man named Dorian walked over to me last Saturday while I was tightening a fitting on that same pipe and asked if I needed a hand carrying my tools back to the truck. I looked up at him, this kid who'd had nothing handed to him his whole life and still offered to carry an old man's toolbox without being asked, and I thought about everything I used to believe money could buy: loyalty, gratitude, a daughter who wouldn't stand in her own kitchen and calculate the convenient date of my death. I was wrong about most of that, but I wasn't wrong about everything. I handed Dorian the toolbox, and he carried it off toward the garage with a straight back and a proud step, the same walk I used to picture Claire having someday, before I understood that the version of pride I'd hoped to raise in her had curdled into something else entirely along the way. I learned, at 71 years old, in the worst possible way, that blood is not the same thing as loyalty, and a house paid for in full cash is worth nothing at all if the people living inside it are only waiting for the deed to change hands. Real family, I've come to understand, isn't the people who share your last name. It's the people who show up to carry your toolbox without being asked, who never once calculate what your absence might be worth to them. If someone in your own life has ever made you feel like your presence was a debt they were waiting to collect on, I hope you find the same thing I found. Kneeling in that dirt, not revenge, though I won't pretend that didn't feel like something, but the clean, quiet peace of building something new out of the wreckage of what you thought you knew. Take care of yourselves out there, and take care of the people who show up for you without being asked twice.